I'm delighted to welcome our speaker for this evening. Dr. Michael Horowitz is an associate professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. His primary research revolves around international conflict and security issues. He's also interested in the intersection of religion and international relations, the role of leaders in international politics, and international security issues in East Asia. He completed his PhD in the Department of Government at Harvard University, where his dissertation examined the diffusion of military power and the consequences for international politics. His other academic projects include studies of how attributes of international leaders influence their decision-making concerning international conflict, the empirical impact of weapons of mass destruction proliferation on international behavior, and North Korean negotiating patterns. So please now join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Horowitz.
Thanks so much for that very nice introduction, and to everybody for coming out today. It's an honor to speak to the World Affairs Council and on a topic that for somebody that studies international conflict, international relations, seemed like it was going away kind of just yesterday. I'm sure many of you, for example, have heard about the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, the pivot to the Asia-Pacific, an effort under the Obama administration to finally shift the focal point of American foreign policy away
The glass
from
half full. Millions lifted from poverty, freed from tyranny, major war.
Glass half full.
in toward Asia. So I teach the intro U.S. foreign policy class at UPenn. And in the spirit of what was going on in global politics, this past spring, I decided to rebalance the class as well. And then I went from essentially having a lecture on U.S. foreign policy toward Europe and a lecture on U.S. foreign policy toward Russia, and condensed those into one, and added an extra lecture on stuff going on in the Asia-Pacific. And then stuff in Ukraine happened. And I still gave the lectures on the Pacific, but I then managed to do, I think, 3 different lectures on Ukraine throughout the semester, tracking what was going on. Just a proof of how bad often we can be at predicting what are going to be the important events in international politics, let alone what anyone's actually going to do. So, I mean, to get to the sort of core of the topic, I think the reason why we're all here in some ways, and the reason why we really care about this is, I mean, and for those of you that remember the Cold War, which I remember very little of, what essentially is the bare back, and which is another way of saying what does Vladimir Putin want, and it was what we saw in the Crimea a few months ago, and what we're continuing to see in eastern Ukraine. Simply the actions of a leader that feels as though he needs to do stuff to reassure his domestic constituency and kind of look tough, or does Putin have broader revisionist aims in international politics? And I think the jury in some ways is still out on that, although I tend to be pretty skeptical of Putin. But I'm also not necessarily, to give you a little sort of overview of where I'm going, that thrilled with American foreign policy. In that the United States has tried to figure out what do we do when Russia invades essentially a sovereign country. What do we do when Russia invades the Crimea? And the answer has been to do what the United States often does when we're upset about something but not upset enough to use military force, which is we impose sanctions, we say strong words, and we try to get an international coalition together to say that we'll do something if you do anything else. But here's the problem, sort of show of hands. Who here would go to war to protect Ukraine if Russian troops rolled over the border tomorrow? All right, we got one.
That's a half a hand.
All right, we got a couple. All right, we got one over there.
Think of the repercussions if we don't.
Well, right. So, and the one of the interesting things, and this in some ways I think is a gap between what the DC sort of consensus is like and what popular opinion is like, is I suspect in this room we had, I think there are, about 70 people here, and about 3.5 people raised their hands. That's a pretty overwhelming majority. I suspect the conversation in Washington would be very different and focused on sort of issues like credibility and those things. And with the idea being there aren't great options for the United States right now. If there was an easy American foreign policy tweak that could somehow prevent aggression by Putin and put this back in a box and make everybody happy, I would like to think, and as someone who spent last year, 2013, working in the Defense Department, I would like to think that we would have done it already. The problem is I don't think that there is one. And so what I'm going to do over the next about 15 minutes is lay out, in some ways, how we got here, a little bit historically, and then talking about the current timeline of what's happened over the last few months. Talk a bit about then what sort of what's going on exactly at the present in the aftermath of the elections in Ukraine, and then talk about U.S. foreign policy and the sort of three different schools of thought that have emerged in D.C. with most people saying that the administration is either doing too much or not enough, and very few people saying that the administration has it just right. And I think that might be because it's almost impossible for anybody to get this particular issue just right. So to start, I think as we all know by now, in 1954, Crimea reverted from Russia to the Ukraine. They were both part of the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country. And Ukraine became an independent country, and there was a twist in that when Ukraine became independent, there were nuclear weapons on its soil. No one's really thinking about that all that hard when the Soviet Union disintegrated, but you all of a sudden had a brand new country with nuclear weapons. It's a little unclear whether they really would have had the ability to use them. But in 1994, in what was called the Budapest Memorandum, Russia promises basically to respect Ukrainian sovereignty. Ukraine said, all right, we'll give up our nuclear weapons. Now, what have we learned over the last several years about what happens when you give up nuclear weapons, or give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons? So there was Gaddafi in Libya, there was Saddam. What other countries have given up their pursuit of nuclear weapons? Well, North Korea didn't. It's not, nuclear weapons in some ways in international politics are like invasion insurance. They don't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to buy a whole lot with that insurance. It's not like you can necessarily coerce lots of people, but it's a pretty good assurance that basically you're not going to get invaded. And Ukraine gives that up in 1994, and Ukraine's military is tiny. It's tiny, not super well trained, and not part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the sort of one of the most important American alliances in the world. So as a political crisis, as we know, unfolded in Ukraine in the fall, and as the government, as the protesters succeeded in Kiev and the government fell, it now seems like Putin was sort of pondering what to do. He had a little problem because the world was in Sochi at the Olympics. And it would look really bad to invade somebody while the Olympics were going on in your country. So he waited like 2 days. And then, on February 24th, additional Russian troops entered the Crimea. And by March 2nd, again, remembering that because Russia basically already had a naval base and it put some military assets in the Crimea, so they brought additional forces in. And then, keeping in mind that Ukraine's military is not exactly like an all-star cast, not their fault. By March 2nd, those bases that are Ukrainian are now in Russian hands. 2 weeks later, on March 16th, there's a referendum in the Crimea, which is a lot like what old elections in the Soviet Union or under Saddam Hussein were like, in that 95% of people apparently voted to join the Russian Federation. And the UN General Assembly, protested. In the United States protested, and no one really did much of anything else beside that. And then about a month later, Putin acknowledged, he claimed for about a month that, hey, these aren't really Russian troops. These unmarked soldiers wearing Russian uniforms with Russian weapons who speak Russian. Who says they're Russian soldiers? They're not wearing flags. Who would know? On April 17th, Putin's like, oh, turns out, guess what? They're Russian. Who knew? So what has the United States done about this? Well, Obama's first response, I'm going to quote from a speech that Obama gave right as the crisis broke. Obama said, "We are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Any violation," this is right after Russia had moved troops in, "any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing. Just days after the world came to Russia for the Olympics, it would invite the condemnation of nations around the world, and the United States will stand with the international community in affirming," this is the important part, "there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine." So Obama gives this speech, and similar to when Obama had set a red line over the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and then when Syria used them, the United States did not militarily intervene. Although there are reasons to think that actually ended up turning out okay. The question then is, all right, what do costs mean? What does it mean for the United States to try to impose costs in the Crimea? And it basically meant what I suggested at the outset, sort of smart sanctions. The United States imposes sanctions on basically Putin's cronies to try to freeze their assets, and the United States. Issued, helped promote this thing in the General Assembly, issued sort of various other condemnations, and tried to get the world together. Meanwhile, a couple of things are going on. One is that both the Ukrainian economy and the Russian economy start declining. The Ukrainian economy, at this point, according to statistics I just sort of pulled up and scribbled down on my way over here, has declined about 4% this year. Inflation's been about 12%, and Ukraine's currency has declined 40% since the crisis started. It's not exactly a healthy economy. Meanwhile, Russia's economy is not necessarily in any better shape. They've seen significant stock market declines and assets fleeing the country as international investors wonder whether Putin's going to expropriate further assets. That's been counteracted a little bit by sort of Russians abroad moving money in, but the Russian economy is clearly also in trouble. And meanwhile, two things essentially have marched on. One is there's a brewing insurgency in eastern Ukraine. Now again, they're separatists in eastern Ukraine who claim that they are not Russian soldiers fighting against the Ukrainian government. And fighting against Ukrainian government control. In fact, they've made some advances in recent days, taking over, I think, a series of border posts in the last 24 hours, and taking up the whole town, actually. Now, the evidence that these troops are actually Russian, with the Crimea, it was sort of laughable. It was like, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, obviously. In the case of Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, or what might be, Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, it's a little more complicated. In that they aren't quite as well armed, quite as obviously uniformed, and so you've had essentially accusations going back and forth throughout different media sources about whether or not these separatists or insurgents or guerrillas, depending on how you want to phrase it, are actually sort of Russian military who happen to be in Ukraine, or not. So there's a little more uncertainty there, and obviously they haven't been quite as aggressive as they were in the Crimea. Part of that is the demographics are different. You had a population of the Crimea that, while not 95% supportive, was certainly more pro-Russian than not. Eastern Ukraine is a lot more complicated. While Eastern Ukraine certainly tilts more Russian than, say, Western Ukraine does, for a variety of historical and economic reasons, it's far from uniform. So an attempt by Russia to openly take over the way that they did in the Crimea will be met by resistance in Ukraine, by Ukrainians. And Russia certainly doesn't want to deal with that. Certainly doesn't want to deal with that kind of insurgency. So that's process number one that's ongoing. Process number two is that in the wake of the protests that brought down the previous Ukrainian government, there was an agreement to hold an election. That election took place on May 25th, and the winner was Petro Poroshenko. And I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. I attempt to not be an ugly American in general, but one way in which I'm totally an ugly American is pronunciation. And he's a billionaire who does business in Russia, and he got about 55% of the vote. Totally respectable. So, what is that going to mean? many people have suggested that that Poroshenko's election means that we can stop worrying. That Russia took the Crimea, will hold the Crimea, but that Poroshenko won, given his business ties in Russia, means essentially that he's a person that the Kremlin can do business with. He's a person that Putin can do business with. So we can expect essentially a low-level insurgency continuing in Ukraine for the indefinite future. Eventually, the Ukrainian government will get a hold of it and roll them back. But probably not much more than that. I would say that's probably the conventional wisdom about where things are going. So hold on to that, and I want to talk about what the American response has been. So there are basically three reactions to the American response, and two of them are, and most people fall into one of the two, like, hey, you're doing something wrong category. The first, and this tends to be for people on the right, although not exclusively, is that the administration is not doing enough. That Ukraine is a democracy, and in fact a democracy that had just featured democratic protests to free itself from a more autocratic regime. It was invaded by an autocracy, and the U.S. does nothing. What does the U.S. stand for, according to this sort of line of criticism, if not to defend actually democratic states from being invaded? Add to that the credibility problem. The concern that if the United States does not stand strong for Ukraine and against Russian aggression, that would encourage two things. One, Russia to be more aggressive. After all, as we learned, I guess in a previous Olympic year, in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, Ukraine is far from the only place on Russia's periphery where Putin has territorial ambitions. And second, what about other countries around the world? China, for example, is engaged in a series of aggressive half measures against the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. There are all sorts of things going on around the world. The concern is that if the United States does not stand strong in this case, it invites aggression elsewhere. There's another perspective, though, which is that the United States has already done too much. This is from people that are traditionally would probably say that they're more they're realists from a foreign policy perspective. For those of you that remember any of your the readings that you may have done in school or afterwards. Hard-headed advocates of American national interests who don't get sentimental about other people around the world. And what realists will walk around telling you these days is essentially that it's too bad for the people of Ukraine, but this is not America's problem. That the Ukraine had the ability to invest in its military to defend itself, and failing that, it had the ability to accommodate Russia, so Russia didn't invade it. It didn't do either of those things. This simply isn't worth American blood and treasure. And that, in fact, the same logic that people would use to encourage a more active American response in Ukraine is the same kind of logic that rolled us into things like the Iraq War, which are very unpopular. I frame this in one way. One group says if you get involved in Ukraine, it's like you're doing the Iraq War over again, and the other group says you're going to cause China and Russia to invade other countries around the world if you do nothing. So, clearly there should be an in-between point, right? Well, the Obama administration would argue that it's found that happy medium. That they set up an initial sanctions regime, they then strengthened that sanctions regime, and they've gotten the rest of the world to at least condemn Russia's behavior. But it's what Obama's been doing over the last week that I think will be more important for determining whether we ultimately judge U.S. foreign policy as a success. Because Obama's been over in Europe, and he's been in Eastern Europe, and he met with the incoming Ukrainian president, and he's been talking with American allies in the region. Because Ukraine may not be a member of NATO, but Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland sure are. And those countries are all now much more worried about Russian aggression and an American security commitment to them than they were several years ago. So the United States is treaty bound, and a treaty that the President signed and Congress ratified. That if a NATO country was invaded, the United States is obligated to come to its defense. But then again, all right, so let's do the show of hands again. So suppose Russia invades Lithuania. Should the United States use military force to stop it? Yes. All right, that's better. All right, we're getting a little more aggressive. I like it. But these issues are complicated because from a pure national interest perspective, after all, who is Lithuania? It's the implications of a NATO ally being invaded that we think of as particularly important. And so that's why the president a few days ago announced a $1 billion European reassurance fund, which is essentially $1 billion in additional military aid for NATO countries on Russia's periphery to help them build up their militaries. I mean, to be fair, that's chump change at the end of the day compared to what it would actually be like if Russian troops came over the border. But it's a signal of America's commitment. And if the goal at the end of the day is to deter Putin from engaging in adventurism, that's not a bad thing at all. The other thing the president agreed to do, and this goes back to where I started. Remember how I rebalanced my class, toward the Asia Pacific? After essentially almost several years, and I can tell you from my time in the Defense Department, an extremely strong commitment to a large reduction in America's military footprint in Europe, some of that is going out the window. And the president has promised that more U.S. forces will be rotating through Europe than the United States had previously planned. Now, on the one hand, that's great, because it could help ensure that Putin is deterred. On the other hand, for those interested, say, in the defense budget coming down as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq wind up, you probably aren't that thrilled to hear it. Or if you think that the United States needs to keep its eye on the ball, but the ball is China, then you're probably not all that thrilled to hear that, because this is then, from another perspective, the United States has been trying to rebalance to the Asia Pacific since the Clinton administration. But you've had a series of events from 9/11 to the Iraq War, to tension with Iran, to the Middle East peace process, and now to Russia and Ukraine, that the United States is like, it's like the Godfather. They keep trying to get out, and they keep getting dragged back in. And so it could potentially imperil then the rebalance of the Asia Pacific. So these are complicated problems, and there's not an easy answer to it. Because I suspect if you showed up at a random office in the State Department or the NSC staff today, you'd hear people. I mean, they probably wouldn't openly argue about it if they knew that you were there. But if you could be a fly on the wall, I bet they do. Because the muscle movements that the United States is starting to engage in to respond to Russian aggression will trade off with other things around the world. And when everybody here has a budget, when your budget's not unlimited, you have to make choices. And the question is, what kinds of choices should the United States be making? And I'll wrap up by saying that I think the choices we should be making depends, this gets in some ways to academic research I do on leaders in international politics, on what kind of leader Putin is. After the Russian invasion of the Crimea, and especially after Putin said some uncomfortable things about living space for ethnic Russians, it led to the use of some people breaking out their 1930s Germany playbook to talk a bit about Putin. And obviously, I think that's a bit extreme. On the other hand, Putin would have you believe that he's just trying to bring Russia back to its rightful place in the world. I have never seen a country happier to just be at the negotiating table than Russia. There's no country in the world happier just to show up. Because showing up and being, say, like on nuclear arms control negotiations with the United States, that means they still get to be equal. In that sense, that Russia lost something when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that Russia should recapture that, invades the way Putin thinks about the world. If you read his speeches, if you read what he thinks about things, he's now demonstrated on several occasions that he's willing to use force to try to achieve his goals. And he's willing to use basically just as much force as he can get away with before the international community might really either clamp down on him, or, if you want to put a positive spin on it, be forced to tell him, hey, we're not really going to do anything about it. And so what kind of leader is he? I tend to think Putin, maybe he's not a leader if you give him an inch, he'll take a mile, but he's certainly going to take a couple of feet. And I think that the consequence of what we've seen in Ukraine over the last few months is likely to be further Russian aggression on their periphery. But again, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do, we, putting my American hat on, are going to be able to do a whole lot to stop them. I think that what the United States is doing now to reassure its allies and partners in NATO and other places in the world is exactly something that the United States should be doing. And I think they will be reassured, and I think that will deter Putin from going after a NATO ally. But what Ukraine has now taught Putin, and potentially taught Chinese leaders about countries that are not American allies in Asia, is that we take that definition of ally very seriously. And that if you're not in the like legally signed document circle of trust, then you can push against that country a lot more than if a country is an actual American ally. And that's something that makes me nervous about where Putin may be going next and about what may happen in Ukraine, particularly as, which I think will inevitably happen, the government comes back over the top against the separatists, and Putin faces a choice of ethnic Russians losing a military struggle in eastern Ukraine. And with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Yeah, you referred back to the Cold War, and moving back to the Cold War. For a few of us dinosaurs around here, we can go back a little earlier. I can equate Georgia to the Sudetenland. I can equate Ukraine to Czechoslovakia. I can equate Putin to Hitler. I can equate Obama to Neville Chamberlain. And you could say, okay, the distraction in Asia, you could say China is the distraction the same as America had the distraction with Japan. And you could also say this group here, which is a fairly educated group, is no different than America was in 37, 38, 39, 40, where we wanted to be isolation. We didn't even, when England was on the brink of falling, we still, the majority of the people didn't want to be involved.
So is Rand Paul or Charles Lindbergh?
Yeah, I don't know. And I'm not a right wing. I'm a liberal, but I see, each move that Putin makes, and we do nothing, is somewhat similar to Hitler. Now they're two different individuals, they're two different countries, but Putin is trying to reclaim the glory of Russia, just the same as you could arguably say part of Hitler's strategy was to get back the glory of Germany after its defeat in World War I. I spent a lot of time in Russia on business, and one of my drivers was a colonel in the Russian army, and when I was over there when Putin came in, and his biggest concern was Putin going to be strong enough to handle Russia. He said the Russian people need a strong leader who's going to bring back Russia. If he doesn't, he says, I'm not sure democracy's ever going to work in this country. They need somebody that's a strong man, and that's what the Russians will respect. He says, you got to remember, we never had democracy in this country in our whole history.
That's a great question, and it's a great question. And I think actually one of the, in fact, I wrote down a little note to mention it and then forgot, so this will give me a good opportunity. I think one of the underplayed stories of the whole crisis in Ukraine is the way that Putin has exploited it to launch a human rights crackdown within Russia. And that this has been a pretext for significant media, human rights, other kinds of restrictions that's turning Russia even more autocratic. And so I think it's actually important to keep that in mind when we think about what the consequences of this conflict have been thus far. I tend to think that Putin is not Hitler, even beyond issues involving Jews or Holocaust kind of related things. I think, and for one reason that is maybe lucky historically, and one reason that's not. I think the reason that's not is that I think that Putin has a pretty clearly defined, if you read his speeches, I think he has a pretty clearly defined vision of what a good Russia, the Russia that deserves to be in place, what that Russia looks like. I think that's very different than sort of Hitler's ambitions, which essentially were unconstrained. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't agree with Putin's ambitions, and I think that the United States should be strong in preventing him from achieving them. But I think he does have a limited set of ambitions compared to Hitler. So that's the reason that relates to, I think, the two leaders. The reason that's just sort of lucky is that, Europe in the 1930s was a powder keg. It was, and especially that territory around Central Europe, which had been the location of sort of decades of back and forth and in warfare, essentially starting with depending on how you want to time it out, maybe like the German wars of unification, up through the Second World War. That traced in some ways around like Germany trying to find its way in the world. I don't think that we face the same. The lucky thing is I don't think we face the same security dilemma on Russia's periphery, in part because its neighbors are pretty weak, and in part because I think global politics has changed a bit, and pulling off that kind of naked aggression is more difficult. But if the U.S. doesn't do anything, then it will make it more likely that he tries to take those couple of feet.
I just came back from Ukraine. I was international.
Well, you should be up here.
I was the international election monitor for the presidential elections of May 25th, and I was in Kyiv, speaking to the people and getting the feedback, how they felt, and basically everyone is so, anti-Putin that you could not believe. They would take up arms if need be. And then the strange thing, I was stationed in a polling station in Odessa. And I thought, here's this international city, and the people might have, different visions. Oh my God, so anti-Russian. It's just unbelievable. So you really, with his policies, he's really got himself into a corner. I don't know how he's going to get out of it. In fact, I met two journalists that went to Donetsk, to eastern Ukraine. Right. They were two Norwegian guys, very huge men. And they said to me, we were terrified. Because he said, you've got people running around that are either drunk or on drugs, carrying Kalashnikovs, having, launchers on their shoulders. And he said, and he feels that they've been pushed to a wall that he said, I don't know how they're going to get out of it. Yeah, it's just frightening. But what I'm saying basically is that the people were very supportive of the government in Kyiv.
I think that's right. And thank you for sharing that. That's really tremendous, and I'm glad that you're back safely. I think it's interesting, especially because it shows how these things can develop, in that even as resentment of Russia increases in Ukraine, that will make it even harder and harder to settle the issue in eastern Ukraine. Even if the government and Putin came to some kind of accommodation at the end of the day. Now that being said, it's important to remember that we have a tendency whenever we United States when we look at a conflict to think that, all right, so the guys doing bad things and the people that are fighting must be the good guys. Not really sure that I'd be that comfortable characterizing Western Ukraine as the good guys, if the good guys is meant as sort of like happy, peace-loving, like democratic, like broadly internationalist, like sorts of folks, which it sounds like your experience was consistent with in Odessa. And then it's not like the oligarchs in Western Ukraine were necessarily the, or like the next Dalai Lama or something. But they're certainly not Putin. I think the important thing is we're going to have to be realistic as we build a relationship with the new Ukraine about what they are and what their interests are. In fact,
You know, I had an interesting experience. We actually protested in Kiev, and our friend worked for the military and said, "Don't go back to Marcus, we're going to kill people." We thought we'd make enough to kill 100 people. That was premeditated.
when was that?
February 15th, something when they killed 100
Sorry,
people.
yeah.
And the protesters were all like peaceful. They were mostly against corruption of the Ukrainian government. They weren't anti-Russian. But also my observation was when I first went to Ukraine in '96, they were pro-Russian in Kiev. They hate Russia now. I mean, it's like Slovakia hates Russia, Poland hates Russia, Estonia hates Russia. It's on the same level. So if Russia ever went into Ukraine, I think it would be the end of Russia potentially. Because these countries around Ukraine would arm them. And you see what happened in Baghdad when the U.S. went into Baghdad.
Oh, it'd be a massive insurgency.
And the Russians, I don't think are really a great army from what my observation. They're pretty lazy. They're actually, half the people now in eastern Ukraine are from Chechnya. You know, the Russian soldiers allegedly won't shoot Ukrainian citizens. This is what we've been told by people in Kyiv. So it's really mixed up. And then the other interesting thing, we went to Sochi, which was frightening because of the cheers for Putin. I thought I was watching Nuremberg rallies in the 30s. Okay, the nationalism. Then I went to Turkey, and the Turks hate the Russians more than the Ukrainians because of the massacres in Syria.
Do you see why we want to get out of Europe?
So it was an amazing trip, all by accident to see the Olympics. But I'm saying, I think this has to be the dumbest leader since Milosevic I've ever read about, because he's united Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel, and he's united all these Eastern European countries that normally were not unified, and they are now. And he's turned the Ukrainian Kiev people anyway, and it's such anti-Russian. It's just remarkable. So.
I think the long term, I think whether it's a win or loss for him in the long run, the international public opinion is clearly turned against him and clearly inflamed, I think, anti-Russian sentiment. The question is what people are really going to be able to do about it. You could easily imagine, let's spin out a world where Russia ends up invading Ukraine proper, and you have some sort of insurgency. You could easily end up in a situation kind of like in Syria, where the Saudis are funding the Syrian resistance against Assad, while the U.S. kind of involved, kind of not involved. You can easily imagine a situation kind of like that developing. It's a dangerous situation, but I think Putin's pretty rational in wanting to keep his job, which is why I think he's unlikely to make a move for Kiev itself, because I think he understands what the consequences of that would be, and that. Like you said, the Russian army is not exactly a Potemkin village. I mean, it could dominate anybody in the region, but certainly isn't where it was during the Cold War as far as training and readiness.
I thought that Putin now is much more popular in Russia than he was before the invasion.
Oh, he absolutely is.
And also, as far as the image of the United States, we used to have friends in Poland. We used to think that we were absolutely the best, and now they're really questioning whether our friendship with them is strong.
That's so when Obama was in Poland yesterday. It's actually one of the statements from one of the former presidents of Poland, arguing that the United States needed to be stronger in confronting Ukraine. In some ways, this is a dynamic that you see in lots of kinds of alliances where you have a weaker country and a stronger country. And the weaker country is forever saying, prove you love me, prove you love me, prove you love me. And the stronger country's like, don't worry, we got your back, trust us. And so I think there's a little bit of that dynamic going on. I think that the U.S. and Poland actually have a very good defense and diplomatic relationship right now. And I expect that I expect a good chunk of that, the European Reassurance Fund, to go to Poland, because I think the U.S. views Poland as sort of the linchpin of its Eastern Europe strategy. So I think we'll see a bunch of support for Poland.
You've danced around this topic, and that is you haven't once mentioned the major EU countries and what you think they ought to be doing.
So that's a fair point to call me out on that. Don't forget, this whole thing, the balloon went up when the protests in Ukraine. when we do a controversy over an association agreement that the government was talking about signing with the European Union. Our friends and partners in the European Union are not arrayed for the use of military force in most situations. I think right now, and in some ways are much better configured after a decade of conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq for expeditionary-ish conflicts like Libya than for a more classic sort of show of force, border, like move some troops into Eastern Europe, kind of thing. Not that those Eastern European countries would necessarily want them there, but I think Germany's role here is really interesting. Germany, Merkel has not seemed too keen to really crack down on Russia, and if what we know about when, remember those smart sanctions I talked about against Putin's cronies? One of the things we know about economic sanctions, well, is that it's difficult to make them work, but your probability goes up a whole lot if you can get all of the major trading partners for a country aligned, which is not really what we have. Here. And in some ways, I think one of the interesting things that, and I'll say this as someone who's often been very critical, who's often, especially 10 years ago, very critical of the French. The French have actually been a lot. French foreign policy over the last several years has actually gotten a lot more assertive and a lot more in alignment with the United States, and I think you see that in some of France's reaction to this as well. In some ways, because we don't pay that much attention to it. It's sort of, I think, it's an underplayed good news story in thinking about the alignment between our countries. But Germany's essentially defection, and given Germany's weight in the EU, has meant the EU just hasn't. The EU basically wants to be able to make a lot of money trading with Ukraine. And they're going to do whatever they can to try to make sure they can make a lot of money trading with Ukraine. I'm not sure we can count on them to do anything else besides that.
But isn't that the whole reason why poor old Obama is sitting here with a toothless strategy or tactic? I mean, because the Europeans who really ought to be, buckling down on these sanctions, they don't have the guts to do it. I want your opinion. I don't want your report.
I would rather the Europeans spent a lot more money on their defense. I mean, I side with what former Defense Secretary Gates said right before he left office, in that the achievement of essentially peace on the European continent over the last 50 years was a blessing for the world, but a consequence was that many European countries forgot that threats existed, and that they really needed to invest in their militaries. Many of our European allies, and I think this is bad, are well below the investment that's legally required of them, actually, as NATO allies. And I think what the intervention in Libya showed was that even when our European friends want to take the lead, they sometimes lack the capacity to do so. But in terms of, I think so I'm frustrated that they're not doing more on the sanctions front. On the military front, I just don't think there is more they can do. I think here's the test. I think if we were back in this room a year from now, so European defense budgets have declined every year basically for the last decade. I think a true test of whether or not Europeans are really picking up that Putin is a dangerous fellow and they need to be serious about defending themselves will be if you look at European defense budgets that are revealed over the last year and see if you finally have a reversal in that decade-long trend, because that would demonstrate a shift in European threat perceptions. I'm not sure this is enough to do that, because I think they view that as so far away that they wouldn't be involved, which what's my opinion? I disagree with that, but I'm not terribly optimistic about especially Germany changing its mind.
What about the ships that the French are planning to deliver to Russia? I mean, that mentioned them becoming more assertive, but that doesn't seem like it's going to help the situation.
Well, I mean, they still want to trade. I think the problem is that they think of this as I think our European friends view this as sort of a done deal. They've internalized Crimea as part of Russia again. They want to stand strong against. I think it's back to what I said before about NATO. To the extent that there's potential aggression against a NATO country, they want to be reassuring about that. But beyond that, and especially when it comes to ships, sort of naval kind of assets that aren't really relevant for what's going on, I just don't think they're that engaged. That is a good counterpoint to the general sort of new assertiveness of French policy.
I actually wanted to just follow up on the dinosaur point of view, in that.
Oh, look, listen, I feel like I would have been a great Cold Warrior if only I'd had the chance.
It strikes me that, the Sudetenland and Crimea analogy that you make happened at a time when we didn't have the big fat international institution called the UN that we have now as a result of that war. And I wanted your 2 cents on maybe rebalancing the seats at the table there, and how Russia sort of acts as a impediment to the U.S. Endeavors all over the place. And if there were more seats at that table or more vetoes at that table, that would bring more power to bear on this, and not just his immediate neighbors. It would be the whole international community that would maybe get involved. And if it wasn't so feckless, the whole international community could donate a little military, so it's all of us together going against this aggression, and not just Belarus and Latvia and Moldova. Right. Yeah, that's my question.
No, it's a good question. I agree with the sentiment, although I'm not terribly. I mean, you need Russia's approval essentially to change the voting rules, and that gives them a pretty good veto. I mean, one of the interesting things there is stuff kind of on the table right now about an Indian seat, about a Brazilian seat, even there's still a little discussion about a Japanese seat, and I think you're more likely to see an Indian or Brazilian seat before you see just about anything else. But again, I mean, we're back. I mean, in regards to this, we're back in a Cold War kind of situation where we have an international institution that was designed to do something that can't do it because Russia's sort of stopping it, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that except create coalitions of the willing outside the confines of the United Nations. And that's then a test of our diplomatic acumen. Can we build those kinds of security and economic institutions, even if we don't have necessarily the backing of the United Nations?
I'd like to hear your view on the economic motivations of Putin, in particular oil and gas, and the dire demographic situation in Russia if you look over, say, a 10 or 20-year time frame, and whether these play into the motivations to do something now.
So, I was over in Japan. This will relate, I promise. I was over in Japan in early February, and I was up in the morning. I'm at the gym on the treadmill. There's a little TV on it. It's like trying to find like an English language channel, and it's like a BBC channel. And on the BBC channel is this guy speaking with an English accent. It was produced for a Japanese audience, talking about how, contrary to what everything we know from world history suggests, that Japan was aging was actually going to be good for its economy and future as a global power. And I nearly fell off the treadmill. In that, I mean, one of the sort of iron laws of global politics, I think over a several hundred-year period, is that demographic contraction is rarely a positive sign when thinking about future economic growth, future military power, innovativeness in a society, all those sorts of good things. One of the reasons why I think the United States is I'm bullish on the United States staying on top is in fact that we've managed through, especially immigration and other things as well, to avoid that kind of contraction. And so I think I'm not sure. I would be surprised. I mean, I'm not in Putin's head. I would be surprised if Putin rolled into the Crimea thinking, well, we're going to be really old in 10 years, so we better do this now. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are Russian military planners who think about that, and that shapes the sort of advice they give, and then that filters up indirectly when they think about the costs and benefits of different kinds of activities. Because they look at the shadow of the future and they think that they might be a little bit weaker, potentially, in the future. The oil and gas issue, though, is I think tricky. I mean, I think it's part of the answer to one of the previous questions about Europe, which is that Russia's the leverage that Russia holds over Western Europe, especially from an oil and gas perspective, I think drives at least a good chunk of what's going on now, which is why some people are like, oh, if only we can get American natural gas exports. Can't we just speed that up really quickly so we can just get all that natural gas over there so we can cut off Russia? It's not quite that simple, but I think that certainly played a role, especially, I mean, Gazprom had a deal set up with the Ukrainian government, with the prior Ukrainian government, basically for preferential pricing, that basically went out the window once the protests overturned the government. I'm not sure that's really a pretext to invade the Crimea. I will say that controlling the Crimea there are some strategic functions to that. When we think about what we want the pipelines to look like over the next 10 to 20 years. And so that's a place where I think this could end up having an implication on oil and gas issues.
Mr. Horowitz, so Euro-Atlantic powers have chosen OSC monitors, since, as you addressed with the UN situation, and the fact it's not European Union forces in Ukraine or NATO can't be involved, but is there any other mechanism, and are lessons to be drawn from just 15 to 20 years ago in the former Yugoslavia, but, and I'm glad Yolanda chose not to be a OSC monitor since they're being detained and kidnapped about every day. So is there any other mechanism from a Euro-Atlantic international perspective, separate from the UN, that would at least allow the international community in the U.S. leading the European Union again to another trouble spot of the world to bring some rhyme, reason, and stability in a form, in a more positive way without troops on the ground?
My brow is furrowing, so I think you can predict where I'm going to go with my answer. I'm not sure there's another really healthy institution that can do this. If the EU can't do it, and NATO can't do it, and the OSCE doesn't really have the power to do a whole lot. I think one of the issues that we face in Ukraine right now, and this is a place where, I hope that the U.S. government is essentially leveraging all of the information we get from people who are going to Ukraine over the last several months, because one gets the sense sometimes, reading about what we say, that we, United States, we are actually kind of uncertain about what's going on in eastern Ukraine some of the time, and that doesn't make me happy. And I think there's an information gap problem right now that speaks to the difficulties people are having in getting sustained international observation, or even sort of real journalistic kind of observation into those parts of Ukraine. But I'm not that optimistic about it. I mean, it works in the former Yugoslavia because if like Russia didn't exist and we were just talking about separatists, sure, but I think Russia being on the border and having an interest here, really changes the equation. If you really wanted a Hail Mary, you could imagine a world in which you had something like African Union peacekeepers. You get somebody from outside the region. You get like Sri Lankan and Indian peacekeepers. Since a lot of the countries that contribute forces to UN peacekeeping operations have nothing to do with the particular regions. Their militaries actually make a lot of money off of participating in UN peacekeeping operations. So there are a bunch of militaries around the world that actually have fairly well-trained, robust peacekeeping forces. And so you wonder whether or not could you get something together not under the auspices of the UN to send basically people from outside the region, because maybe then Russia would regard them as not as threatening. Maybe. I think that's obviously a Hail Mary. That's not a hey, I'm really in the battle.
I'm Paul Stick with the BBC in my earpiece, so I might have dreamt this, but I thought I heard that the Chechen separatists were involved somehow in Ukraine. And what I recollect is that they were involved on the side of the Russians and not the Ukrainians. Does that make any sense, or am I?
There are some Chechens over there. I mean, the Chechens have no love for the Russians. The Chechens don't particularly love the Ukraine. The Chechens are actually Chechen. I think. I mean, this isn't really sort of their. This isn't sort of really their fight. I haven't seen anything actually great on Chechen jihadis fighting for the Russians, but
the Chechens are with the government, which Putin put the government in, so they're paid, and the Chechens are not the ones that fault the Russian government. They're on the other side.
And they
which would explain, yeah.
We've heard an enormous amount of complaints about Obama not being strong enough. We've had very few comments about what they would like him to do, other than starting World War III, and nobody has really said that. What do they want him to do?
I think you're making a fair point. I mean, I myself, I totally said, I'm sure I said like 3 or 4 times already, I want the U.S. to be strong. I have no idea what we should do. Sorry, I guess I shouldn't be that honest. But I mean, I know things that I think the United States should do that would make me feel better that the United States is trying to be strong. The problem is that, I mean, this all becomes it's like playing a game of cards. And the question is, if you don't want to go to war, if you don't want to fight World War III over Ukraine, then advocating significantly more active American moves in Ukraine is basically just bluffing. And if you want to think about the implications for American reputation, so right now we take a reputational hit because we are seen by some of our, we're working on the perception of our Eastern European allies, but we're seen especially by some friends and partners in other parts of the world as not standing up to aggression. So we take a reputational hit. Can you imagine the reputational hit if we threatened Russia in some way, and then they called our bluff and we backed down? That'd be way worse. And so I think that's certainly something the administration is thinking about. And it's why there's not an easy answer here. Because most of you can ramp up economic sanctions, you can try to do things to restrict Russia's involvement in international institutions. Now, all those things will just make Putin more popular domestically at home in the short term. So that doesn't really, it's not like it's going to change Putin's mind about anything. I think that being said, I think the best hope of changing Putin's perceptions over the long term might be if the damage to the Russian economy is as bad as people say it is, then that sort of pressure that Russia in many ways is bringing on itself through its own behavior might be the kind of thing that will change Putin's perceptions over time, because that's the kind of thing that will make him realize that, because again, wanting to stay in office, he'll then maybe back down on some things to try to bolster the Russian economy again. And that's a place where additional sanctions and where the United States investing diplomatic capital and trying to convince other countries to cooperate in those sanctions can be helpful. But beyond that, I think you're right, and that I think some critics of the Obama administration are unfair. It's a very American thing. We want to do something. I mean, my students will say, like, hey, why haven't we fixed the civil war in Syria yet? Hard question.
But when we signed, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum, it wasn't only that Russia signed it, but the United States and Germany signed it. So there is, I mean, what happens with that? And the perception in the whole world with Iran, why would they give up their nukes?
Oh, I think the chances that Iran gives up its pursuit of nuclear weapons are very, I mean, unless their economy is just trashed and the mullahs are about to go out of power, I'm not optimistic about the ability to negotiate away Iran's nuclear weapons.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'd love for it to be a student. Is there a student with a question?
You like kids.
Not put on the spot at all. Nobody?
No, go ahead. She has one.
Okay, stand up.
What is the probability that political science like you can figure out what Russia's endgame is, and then potentially help America to make a better decision?
So what are the chances that somebody like me can actually figure out what Putin's doing and help the U.S. make a better decision? Well, so people like me try to do that in a couple of different ways. One is that, so as I mentioned, I spent last year working in the Defense Department, and I'm still a consultant for the office that I work for, and so I'll actually be down in D.C. all of next week, and I'm sure some of this will come up. So that's one way is sort of interacting directly with the government, sort of giving them advice. The second is, so I've an academic research project on leaders in international politics, and writing sort of op-eds and things to try to influence what sort of opinion is like in Washington over what the United States should do. I think that's another thing. But I think the most important thing that you can do actually is as a professor is have an informed opinion, but don't be too confident that the people that disagree with you are stupid. Because one of the biggest takeaways I had working for the U.S. government for a year is that it's easy for us to sit on the outside and say, I've got a great idea for what to do. Then you get on the inside, and it turns out that someone actually has your idea on the inside, and they're not doing it. And the reason why they're not doing it is either that it's actually not a great idea, but for reasons you didn't know because you didn't have access to the information. Or maybe it is a great idea, but there's a big bureaucratic obstacle that's stopping it from happening. So I think what people like me can do is try to do more research on this, and then when we have ideas, to feed them into the parts of the U.S. government process to basically help the people that agree with us, win the governmental, win the debates to actually change policy. And I think the encouraging thing from that perspective is that our government actually, sometimes all indications to side, actually this administration has been fairly interested in reaching out to academia, reaching out to alternative voices to get their perspective. Now, whether they actually do what those people say is a different question, but they definitely reach out to ask.
Well, please join me in thanking